welcome to Games as Lit 101. Over the last couple weeks, we've talked about adaptation, namely what it is and what it takes and all the difficulties that has plagued our attempts to actually take video game stories and tell them in other mediums. So today we're going to switch that scenario around a little bit and instead talk about what it takes to adapt other stories into video games. I don't think I need to say that the majority of attempts at this have been, well, catastrophic. The vast majority of video games directly based on other media have just been rushed out for a simultaneous release with some big Hollywood movie, and the good ones can probably be counted on one hand, let alone the truly great ones. We've had a bit more success with indirect adaptations, at least. Some big franchises like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings have actually had a few pretty good games released under their names that expand the universes of their respective franchises with some detailed world building, solid storytelling, and some pretty good gameplay. Even more rarely, we've actually had a few pretty interesting games based on books. Hey, no, Dante's Inferno, no! Get out of here! Get the— Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, look, the point is that most video games that are adapting stories from other mediums haven't been very good. But that's not to say they can't be, alright? It's certainly possible, we just haven't usually been approaching it quite right. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the difficulties we've had and what it's going to take to actually make some good adaptations into the interactive medium of video games. So then, what could be great about this? Why should we care? Well, as I've mentioned in the last couple episodes, there is an inherent value in adapting a story from one medium into another because it tells the story in a new way while also bringing that story to a new audience. I doubt most gamers would have read the Russian novel Metro 2033 before the game came out, but now a lot of people have actually experienced one form of the story and many of them have actually gone on to read the original novel as well. Even better, there are a lot of things that interactivity has to offer to storytelling. It can really bring the themes of a story and the struggles of a character to life by making the player live through them instead of observing them. In fact, I can think of a number of classic tales that would make for some rather compelling interactive stories. But there are a number of difficulties that come with trying to adapt a story from a linear medium into the interactive context of video games. They're not impossible to overcome, but we do need to figure out how to overcome them if we plan on making some truly great interactive adaptations. The biggest problem right now is that we tend to design almost exclusively for action and combat in our games. Even games that don't revolve around killing your enemies still tend to revolve around not being killed by someone else, which certainly isn't appropriate for a lot of great stories out there. Most video games require some long action scenes, longer than your average action scene in a movie, that don't really do much to move the story forward, and that isn't particularly conducive to a lot of stories told in other mediums. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows certainly has more violent conflict than previous books, being the one where everything kind of falls apart, but there's still not actually that much fighting in it. And what fighting is in the story isn't often something you could actually build a traditional video game battle of. Nagini's attack about halfway through, for instance, isn't a boss fight so much as a scramble for survival, and besides, Neville one-shot that thing, because he's just that pro. But if you play the games, you're fighting all the time. It's a freaking third-person shooter with wands and spells instead of guns and bullets. Voldemort's strategy in that game is send a million Death Eater mooks at Harry, and you spend a ton of time fighting them off. Even the final encounter with Voldemort— I'm sorry, that was really stupid. Can we do it again? Alright, sorry, back to the adaptation and stuff. Even the final encounter with Voldemort turns into this big battle, a test of skill instead of the event of sacrificial love and dedication it was in the original story. It doesn't even put the King's Crossing scene in the game, because who needs the most thematically pivotal moment in the entire freaking series? And this is the major problem that we run into. Video games, by and large, tend to solve the problems of the narrative based on the skills of the player. Which sounds obvious, really, and it makes plenty of sense. Games are, after all about the skillful completion of challenging tasks. But a lot of great stories out there, from Casablanca to Avatar: The Last Airbender to Much Ado About Nothing, aren't actually based on the hero having better skills than the other guy. They're based on issues of morality, or values, or personal growth. Now, this isn't to say that a video game needs to be perfectly, 100% absolutely faithful to its source material. It doesn't, and it shouldn't be. But it really should try and be faithful to the themes and meanings of the original story. And changing Harry's final encounter with Voldemort into Harry just being better at mashing buttons than him really doesn't do justice to that story. It's possible to get around this, of course, but it would take some relatively risky and experimental design, or perhaps just something more along the lines of Telltale games than Gears of War. But when it comes down to it, that doesn't happen very often, because almost every single game that's based on an existing story is based on a movie and released simultaneously with it. Now, that's not inherently bad, but it does mean that the vast majority of attempts to retell existing stories in the medium of video games are just rushed out quickly to make a quick buck off moviegoers, and that's rarely how good adaptations end up getting made. You may notice that the vast majority of the few good adaptations we do have in video games are actually based on stories that are at least a few years old. And this is why. The creators are actually trying to retell an interesting story, not just to exploit the popularity of a new movie. But there's also the question of what we can actually bring to the stories that we adapt. As we discussed in the last couple weeks, adaptation is not just translation. The goal isn't to take an existing story and just retell it in the exact same way. We can and should bring something new to the story. Sure, I mean, we could just retell the story between gameplay segments using only cutscenes or something like that, but there really should be something that video games can offer, something that this medium specifically can bring to change the experience or bring a new perspective on an established story. Well, any game could utilize some minor narrative interactivity to give the story a bit more punch and make it a little more personal, but then the other major option would be to actually add choices and branching storylines. Though some fans of the original might not appreciate that, since any minor changes to a beloved story tend to be met with derision. That said, it's not always a bad thing. Some stories would actually lend themselves quite well to this idea. Shakespeare's Henry V, for example, would probably make a pretty excellent RPG using BioWare's RPG structure. Shakespeare's been adapted and retold countless times in countless different ways, so there wouldn't be much room to object here, and Henry actually makes a lot of rather interesting decisions that would provide some pretty compelling moral conflict for the player. The short of it is that we need to be open-minded and try stuff. See how adding interactivity to a story can add meaning instead of just changing it, or even worse, eliminating it. And that's why, following this 3-part series on adaptation, I'm going to be doing some occasional episodes in the show where I speculate about how a specific story could be adapted into a video game. And in the meantime, I would love to hear what you guys think of all this, because I just think adaptation is super interesting, so get to talking about it in the comments. Next week, it's time for more literary analysis. But considering Valentine's Day is coming up, we're gonna celebrate it by talking about romance in games. So watch this show instead of going to see 50 Shades of Grey, and we'll all be better off for it. So until then, class dismissed.